Hey James, so good to see you, man. How are you doing?
I am good. And how are you doing, Adrian?
I'm doing good. I'm doing well. I'm well. Really excited for our time today together. I've been looking forward to this probably for the whole month. So really glad that it's here. The 25th of March, last Saturday in March, when we get together as a community and just kind of learn together.
Now, you've had quite a week. Just for everyone who's listening, maybe you want to share what's happened this week.
Oh yeah, it was actually quite a journey. So I had a major surgery on Monday, a hip surgery on Monday. So that was pretty intense, and I've been pretty much hospital for the last 4 days or so. So I came home on Friday. So of course my wife was glad to see me. My boys were glad to have me home. I'm glad to be home as well. So now I'm on the mend, learning to walk again on the recoup. But all that makes it, even more special being here with you guys during this time. So I really love you guys and love this community.
And um, Swiss hospital food, how was it?
To be honest, I was a little scared, right? So I would have been 10. So my friends from the Caribbean and friends from Africa told me, the food is gonna be bland, it's gonna be bad, and I was thinking, oh my gosh, I'm gonna starve for 4 days. But to be honest, it wasn't as bad as I thought it would be. So some meals I enjoyed more than others for sure, but it wasn't as bad. So I survived. But it's always good to be home. Always good to be
Nice.
home.
Great. Well, I'm looking forward to this evening as well. I'm excited to have our guest Chip come and share and interview him too.
Indeed, indeed, so meet. So, just a little bit. So, some of you might be here for the first time, with Geneva Connect and Nova Project. So, just want to give you a little overview of who we are, what we're about. Then we're going to jump right into our session with Dr. Chip Roper of the Voca Center. So, who are we? Yeah, Geneva Connect is kind of three things. So, one, we consider ourselves a community of missional believers in the workplace of Geneva. We're also a space where we get together in the workplace across Geneva and we connect with each other, to learn and practice what it means to really live out the kingdom's reality in the context of our workplace. And also a piece of training, on how we can create, and run workplace communities within our own workplaces in order to extend the influence of Christ within the workplace and within the city. So that's kind of our heart and our mission and our mandate. And we get together to practice five, what we call five rhythms. So we come together to pray and to listen together. We come together so we can build friendships and relationships together. We come together to learn together, like today. We come together to innovate and create new ways of living out the reality of the kingdom in our workplaces. And of course, to serve our workplaces and our city together at large. So we gather for that purpose. But after we gather, of course, we want to scatter to our own workplaces by forming our own workplace communities where we again repeat those same five practices, but within the context of our own workplace community, with the hope and the confidence of reproducing the image of Christ in our workplaces. That's really our heart, our vision, and our mandate. And our aim is that within the next 5 years, we want to see at least 50 different workplace communities started across different cities in Switzerland, where believers are getting together to learn, network, pray, and extend the kingdom of God together. So that's who we are. That's what we're about. And we're so glad to have you as a part of our community during this live stream. So, with no further ado, I'm going to allow James, or my brother in Christ, my partner in crime, to come on and introduce our speaker for the evening. Let's go to it.
Tonight we are going to be listening, hearing from the Chip Roker from the Voca Center. And Chip has really been doing a lot of thinking about the intersection between faith and the workplace and what role that plays. And so, what we're going to do is we're going to hear from him. He's got a number of strings to his bow. He is an executive coach. He is also has got a doctorate in ministry, He's a businessman, he's a pastor, and also a business consultant. So I hope that is a helpful list. Why don't we bring Chip back in again, and then we can chat with him.
There we go.
Welcome back for take two of
Take
a time.
two. Well, good evening to everybody. It's an honor to be here.
Thanks so
Thanks for
much.
having me.
Most of us are connecting in from Geneva. Chip, tell us where are you connecting in from?
I'm connecting from a very wet and gray New York City, so across the pond. Um,
That's great. And tell us, I've given a little bit of an introduction in terms of who you are. Why don't you do a better job than me?
I don't know. It was pretty good, James. Yeah, so I'm originally from the East Coast of the United States, so the Philadelphia area. Um, I guess kind of some of the things that have run through all the different work I've done. I think I'm a builder. I build things, whether organizations or spaces that create opportunities for people to be transformed. Um, I think that what that's looked like has taken different shapes across my life. So when I first started out, I was in and then I went through a pivot, a change, and did a lot of assessing of who I am and what I should do, and decided or discerned, I should say, it was more of a discerning than a deciding. And we can talk about that. That I should pursue a full time vocational ministry. So I went to seminary in the middle of the United States in the Chicago area, and then came back to the East Coast and pastored a church for 20 years. And probably for the last 5 years of that experience, I really wrestled with, is this really what I'm called to do? And eventually transitioned into what would become Voca. Voca is short for vocation. And so it's an NGO or a nonprofit, we call them here in the States. And I've been doing that for almost 9 years. And I guess it was the early pandemic. Two of my colleagues at Voca, we started another business, and where we do targeted leadership development for companies. So that's growing kind of alongside of Voca. So I feel in some ways I've come back to business here on sort of the tail end of my career, and that's been really interesting.
Thanks, Chip. Hey, listen, I know we're going to dig into discerning and calling, but what I do want to know is how did you make that transition out of pastoring, into this? Because clearly that's some transition. What were some of the signs for you to make that move yourself personally?
Yeah, I think one of the things so I was burned out, um, and in, and for I wasn't so burned out that I needed to quit. I was burned out enough that I needed a rest. I needed coaching. I needed a little therapy, and I needed to figure out why I was burned out, and I needed to re-engineer my work. But through that process, I started to learn a lot more about who I am, how I show up, um, the things that drain me, the things that don't. And so I went through a period of trying to re-engineer my pastoral role in ways that I could still serve my church well, but also maintain health and vitality. And I think I was able to do that for a while. Um, but there was this nagging sense that wouldn't go away even after doing that re-engineering, that there was something else for me to do, and another, even just another place for us to live as a family. And so that nagging wouldn't go away. And I think the sign that kind of tipped it off, James, was that there was an opportunity for me to exit the church and do so in a very, very healthy way. And I like to say that part of leading well is leaving well. And most of us have probably had experiences where leaders left and it wasn't, um, it was less than stellar. It left a negative, a bitter taste. It left a mark. And So I was committed to that. I was just committed that the opportunity arose. Our church uh, merged with a larger church, and so there was a lot of change. There's always change, but there's also a lot of continuity in that, and it continues. It's still there, and it continues to do great kingdom work. And so that was part of what that was sort of the leaving part, I guess, of the transition. And then the other piece was, well, what are you going to do next? And that was a journey of discovery of of talking to as many people as I could. I developed a target around New York City early in the process, and my wife and I agreed that we would look there first. And so I started to connect with everybody I could in New York. I asked all my Pennsylvania friends. So New York City is about 3 hours away from by 3 hours drive from where I lived. And so I just asked all my friends in Pennsylvania, who do you know in New York that I should talk to? I generated a list of 100 people, and I started coming to the city and having coffees, and just exploring where were there opportunities, where was there interest for was for somebody like me, what was it like to live here, um, those types of things. And through that process, an opportunity emerged, and I just jumped in. So, and that whole process really informs a lot of what we do. Because I hired a coach. I used a coach to help me with that transition. That was it was a great investment. It really helped a lot to have somebody to give those best practices, bounce things off of, encouragement when it was hard. Um, so we've baked a lot of those practices into the way we think about vocational transition at Voca.
Cool. I just want to nestle a little bit. I know we were going to come on to thinking about work and discerning calling, but I know that for a lot of people here, and since COVID, the workload has clearly been increasing dramatically, and burnout is a common theme. I was even chatting to a work consultant recently, and they were saying, "Wow, it's crazy. People are on Zoom meetings from 9 to 9, and then all the whole day, and then they're trying to get their stuff done." So and clearly this can impact your sense of calling as well when you're feeling frazzled, when you're feeling burnt out. So what were some of the lessons you learned through that whole period? Because no one goes into their job thinking, I want to get burnt out.
That's right. That's not what we sign up for. It's like that would be like getting married and planning on having a divorce. It's sort of the same thing. We don't do that. Um, I think so. First of all, there's two things to say about burnout. One is it's real. Second, because it's such a buzz, everybody's talking about it. It's probably overdiagnosed. There, there's just times, such stressful seasons at work, times when we're tired. Um, that's that's not burnout. Burnout is a chronic sense of fatigue where your motivation and your performance decline, and you can't recover them by usual means. That's kind of how we define burnout. And so I think, and I was burned out by that definition. So I took a mini break, which I know sometimes is hard to do, but I took 6 weeks off, and that really helped. I I started to work with a coach to discern what about the way I was working was leading me into burnout. There was also some conflict and some other things that were happening in my workplace that I actually said, well, if I'm going to stay here, these things have to change. And our board of directors agreed. And so that was actually another part of there were some structural things that needed to be altered as part of this as well. So I think a break. I think dealing with structural things and understanding yourself um, at a substantive factual level, I think are all keys to navigating burnout. I mean, from a biblical framework, I think we all need a Sabbath, and which means we need 24 hours of non-productive time uninterrupted, non-productive time every week, and we can still do that. Most of us can still do that if we want to, and I do that most weeks. Still, it's still a challenge. So I think it's a multi-layered thing, and we do a study every year, James, of the challenges that people are facing in their work, and it goes out to people all over the world, and burnout is number one. It's the number one challenge.
Thanks for sharing that and being so honest as well. Now, clearly, tell us a bit about the Voca Center and your passion for believers and the workplace. Tell us. Clearly, you shared a little bit your transition out of pastoral ministry into this, but why don't you share a little bit about why you see this work as so important in terms of to help, believers in today's society?
Yeah, well, our work is important because work is important. Work is where most of us will spend more waking hours than in any other single activity over the course of our lives. So we spend a lot of time at work. It has a huge impact on our sense of purpose and well-being. And thanks to organizations like Geneva Connect, there's training and teaching and for folks to think about their work. But we think in the main, most Christians are like sheep without a shepherd when it comes to their work. Pastors don't wade into this very much. They don't hear much about it at church. Even seminaries don't prepare pastors to speak into people's work lives in meaningful and engaging ways. So we think there's a gap there, and we're excited to fill it. And we base our work on this research process that I mentioned just a minute ago. So we every year we rigorously listen to our audiences and what they're dealing with at work, and then we build content around that. We have a podcast called Resilient Faith at Work, which is on all the major podcast providers, and we speak to these issues that people are facing at work. And so work is important, and we are excited about being the folks that listen carefully to people at work and build solutions for them.
Just out of interest, you shared the number one issue being burnout. What was number 2 and 3 in the list of issues that people faced, if you can recall those?
Yeah, number 2 was definitely work-life balance, which is connected. I think there's a couple others that were around this topic of calling. I'm not sure that my work matches my gifts, was I think number 3. There's another one about I'm not sure my work is meaningful, and I'm trying to find meaningful work. Dealing with the challenge of staffing shortages was in the top 5. So people are leaving their jobs in record numbers and finding other jobs, and so that's leaving many organizations understaffed. And the people are still there picking up the pieces, which is why they're on Zoom till 9 at night. So I think those are at least 5 of them. The 6th was how I'm trying to discern how to be a force for redemption in my workplace. That was in the top 6 this year too.
Cool. Thanks for sharing that. That's a fascinating list. We'll have to have you back to tackle some of those other things that are don't fit in that calling category. So I know you've got a few slides to share, which we were going to use as talking points and discussion points for everyone who's watching today. So maybe we can have a look at the first one of those, and we can dig into some of these principles about work and calling.
Excellent. Yeah, we're ready to go. As soon as Adrian pops that up there.
Yeah.
There we go. So let's talk about what is calling. And I think in some ways we're really saying, what is God's plan or will for my work? It's very personal. It's about discernment. And I think of it as 2 different things at once. It's an invitation, and it's also a summons. And in the sense that it's a privilege, it's an opportunity, but it's also not optional. Like if God calls us to do something, we need to do it. And borrowing from Os Guinness a little bit, in his book The Call, he says our calling is not to something, it's to someone first. And he talks about our primary call and our secondary callings. And our primary calling is to Christ. The scripture uses that language that we're called to him. We've been called to follow him, called to represent him in the world. And out of that calling, we see 4 subsidiary areas of calling. There's our work, that's what we're talking about in this broadcast. But there's also our family. If you're part of a family, you're somebody's son or daughter, so you're part of a family. But you may have parents, siblings, spouse, children. Like that's an area of calling. We think we're called to our church, our spiritual community, and we also think we're called to our neighbor. And so we could go through all of those, but this idea that calling is the primary calling is to a person, and then that from that call that flows these other areas of calling. And I guess one thing we're not too keen on the pyramid idea that there's God's at the top and then maybe it's my family, that because it's very hard to live that way. We like this idea that Christ is in the center, and then through that we flow out to these other areas. So we think that's maybe a little more helpful and practical way to think about it. So that's just sort of an introduction to calling, James. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I was gonna dig into that question of which you raised about how big should those different circles be? um, but you answered that partially in saying that actually all of those circles matter. And so I'm just interested in, when you think about that calling to Christ, do you think people see that? How, just thinking about a normal believer on a day-to-day basis, what are some of the mistakes they might make instead of thinking I've got a calling to Christ, to a person?
Well, I think there's and I've had friends say this. They'll say, well, business is business and church is church. Like they're 2 separate spheres, and the church things don't apply to the business things, and vice versa. And they kind of have 2 lives. At university, I had an ethics class where that's what was taught. They said you have your personal self, which has its own values and standards, and then you have your professional self. And so I think we call it bifurcation is what we call it. And but it's actually a lack of integrity, because integrity means integrated, right? And it's actually very hard to maintain, and requires a lot of energy. Which self is committing this crime? It's kind of. So I think maybe that's one of the pieces that it does quote work for some of us, because we can sort of compromise some standards we think might not fit. I think another side of this, though, James, another reason why it may be hard to think of ourselves as called to Christ is because we forget he spent most of his life in a carpenter shop. We forget that he was a worker who was in the workplace most of his life, and we think of him as this holy man in a temple or something. Like he's disconnected from sort of the marketplace and the workplace, and that's actually that's not true. That's not the way Jesus lived his life, and he lived most of his life in the marketplace. He did most of his teaching in the marketplace. We may have there may be just a perception there of him that is actually inaccurate, and like we think he's not interested in what we do in the marketplace, and that's a miss.
So I'm just wondering, as you were sharing there, there's a sense of his divine invitation is to love in that sense. So I'm just wondering whether we can, as I'm looking at this chart, whether we can summarize this a little bit as come and follow me to love your family. Come and follow me to love your work. Come and follow me to love your church. Come and follow me to love your neighbor. How is that a good summary or a bad summary of the divine invitation and divine summons in these and calling?
Well, it's very hard to argue with. Um,
You're making me feel good with that answer.
it's hard to argue with. I mean, I guess I was thinking, I think, I was thinking, well, we're supposed to serve, but yeah, serving is an expression of love, or we're supposed to make things better and improve things and be a redemptive force, I think. But that's an expression of love too. So, you know, love is let's put it this way. Love as action, not love as sentiment, is a powerful way to summarize it.
Now, you hinted a bit earlier that very often pastors are only really interested in the church bubble, and they probably like the family bubble, because if they have healthy families, it means less work for the pastors. But so which of these four circles do you think pastors are generally least interested in, based on your experience and work?
Well, I think it's the work one, and I think there's some reasons for that. Um, one day when I was a pastor, I walked into the office, and I was complaining because uh, people had not opened my latest email, and because you can tell how many people open your email, and our communications person said, "It's Monday morning. They're not thinking about church. They're at work." And it was one of those moments where I realized that I get up every day thinking about church, partially because it's my job and partially because it's my day-to-day reality all the time, but it's really not true for everybody else. And I think I think my imagination needed some reforming there. And there's probably some ego there, if we're honest, that we want people to care about and invest in what we're invested in. And then there's an actual legitimate sense of, if when church is good, when it's healthy and when it's real and powerful and Christ centered, it is good for the people who come. And so there's that side of it too. But I don't know. I think there's a pastor here in the city, in New York City, who he's a great guy. He just said, I just don't think pastors are really ever going to be able to help people with their work. They just do not understand what the workplace is like. And so it's going to take specialists to be able to dig into that. So I think that's probably the one. Even in our survey, we asked people, when do you want help with your work? Like, how can we deliver insights for you as you wrestle with your work questions? And we broke out the full-time ministry people from everybody else. And full-time ministry people want workshops and webinars during the day, and nobody else does. And so they just they just have a different lived experience, and I think it makes it hard to relate to.
Cool. Why don't we move on to the next couple of slides? It's been I know you've got a couple more slides that you want to
Yeah,
run in.
these next
Anything else
couple
you
of slides,
go for it?
they kind of carry on this conversation, and because it goes actually back, James, to your question about why is it hard to live with Jesus at the center at work, and at least in many and all I don't know, many communities of faith, but not just communities of faith. It's part of our Western view. We have what we would say is a not so helpful and not true hierarchy of calling. We think that certain vocations are more honorable than others, and so we have this is what we think of. We think normally, and we put for-profit work down at the bottom of the pyramid. It's the least beneficial to society and humanity, and if you're a spiritual man or woman, you think it's the least spiritual. And so this is all business to consumer, business to business type work. And then up from there, we call the social sectors. And this is work, it's the government, where if you work for the government, education, healthcare, the arts, general nonprofits. And if we don't go any further, in secular Western culture, there's already a belief that social sector work is better work than for-profit work. In the subway here in New York City, there's a sign for a medical school that says, follow your calling, become a doctor or a nurse. Now, if you're an investment banker or a lawyer, we know you don't have a calling. That's just not possible. But if you're a nurse or you work for an NGO, then you have a call. So that idea that there's a hierarchy is already part of our culture. And then when we add the Christian layers to it, there's Christian nonprofit organizations, and then at the top is to be a missionary or to be a pastor. And this is what we've been given, many of us. And so we may think that if we're not in the upper layers of that pyramid, we may think our work doesn't matter as much to God. It's not as legitimate. It's not even maybe a calling at all. And we think that this is unhelpful and not true. So I want to switch it up and show you a picture of how we think it actually works.
Don't switch it too much, because I feel like I'm at the top of the triangle there, so I was feeling quite good about myself. So,
Oh, sorry, James. It's going to get that we're going to turn up the heat here.
okay.
On the and it's what we call reality therapy.
All right.
So
Okay, I'm ready for my therapy now. So
all
hit me
right,
with
we'll
it.
see. We'll see what you think.
Okay.
We have the same four sectors here, and the first thing I want to say about these sectors is that there's a Christian teaching of the idea of common grace, and this idea that God provides for everybody and touches everything. His rain, and the rain falls on everybody, the wicked and the just. His sun shines on everybody, and that's every provision that God gives to the human race is common grace. And then when we think about what He offers us in Jesus, and that we can be redeemed and we can be forgiven and we can have His presence and power in our life, we call that specific grace. And so these sectors of work fall out on that continuum, but they're all ministering grace. They're all ministering grace. So that's a leveler in some ways. And then we like to point out that there's often a redemptive element in each of these sectors. Just to talk about business for a moment, I'll just share an example. I have a friend who has done very well in business, and he used his funding to his excess wealth to start a honey business in Africa, and he now employs the company employs 9,000 people in Africa with living wages. They're the biggest honey producer on the continent, and it's changed not just those 9,000 lives of the people that work there, but their families and their trajectories in terms of their financial capacity and their food security and so many things. I mean, it's really been amazing, because I think that's really redemptive. That's business. It's straight business. And we can think of experiences where NGOs or hospitals or education institutions or Christian nonprofits or churches and missions have done real good in the world. But we can also think of ways that each of these things has been destructive. And we don't like to talk about this very much, but if you've spent much time in a church, or you've gotten behind the scenes in a Christian ministry, you've probably seen some pretty toxic things. And it's easy to point to that group over there who did such and such and such, but it's probably happened to most of us. And so what we have to acknowledge is that instead of this pyramid where some things are just categorically good and some things are categorically bad, the line between good and evil, this is a little spin on the Solzhenitsyn quote, but the line between good and evil cuts down the heart of every sector, not between sectors per se. So we think this is an important mindset shift that really says you can be called to do God's work in any of these sectors, and some of them, and there's going to be redemptive things happening, and there's going to be destructive things happening in every single one. So James,
So
we knocked you off the top of the pyramid. So how are you feeling?
I'm just part of a circle. I'm part of a circle now, but I can live with that. So, yeah, I'm sure by tomorrow I'll try and find a new triangle to climb. So, no, but let's think a little bit about common grace and specific. We've got a number of people on the call today working in the social sector, maybe working in a humanitarian organization. So have you got an example of what common grace or specific grace might look like in that sort of sector?
Well, I think there's a three-part there's a three-part paradigm that we use when we think about what is God doing in the world on the common grace side. And it's from Psalm 127 and Psalm 104. So Psalm 127, it says, unless the Lord builds the house, the builders labor in vain. Unless the Lord protects the city, the guards stand watch in vain. And the third is from Psalm 104, verse 15, which says, he gave them, the man goes out to in the morning, comes back at night, and he gave them wine and bread and oil. Wine to make him glad, oil to make his face shine, and bread for strength. And so we think there's three kinds of work that God is doing in the world that reflect this idea of common grace. There's creative work, that's God building the house. So anytime any of us is engaged in improving something, making something new, delivering a new solution, creating doing a startup, we're building with God. It doesn't say we build for God or we build like God. It says, unless the Lord builds a house, the builders labor in vain. He's active in some behind the scenes providential way. A second type of work that's from Psalm 127 is protective work. And unless the Lord guards the city, the guards stand watch in vain. So any of us that are involved, and this may fit with those of you in the international space, if you're doing anything like, for instance, that's protecting people who are vulnerable populations. So if you're fighting trafficking or fighting global slave trade, if you're fighting you're trying to institute good governance practices and lobbying for those types of things. I think they kind of fit into that protective, fighting back the negative effects of sin and systems and negative effects of the fall. And then the last one there from Psalm 104 verse 15 is this idea of provision, just the provision. If you're doing work that helps people get food and clothing and medical care, that's God is providing, and He does it through us. And so those are ways we don't just work for God or do something good. It's the Scripture actually says we do it with Him, and I think those are common grace. Those would be common grace examples. To me, specific grace, James, is when we're explicitly talking about Jesus or pointing to Jesus, and so then we can usually do that as individuals, in terms of as people ask us about what our values are and what we believe and why we do what we do. And of course, then there are organizations that do that and are officially Christian, like World Vision, for instance.
I guess would another example of specific grace being when we are relying on Him and trusting Him in different aspects of our work. In that sense, would that be another example of specific grace as a believer?
Yeah, and we could even. It's maybe risky depending on your context, but that doesn't mean you should not do it. But we say we prayed about this, or we ask God for wisdom. Find some way to give God credit. Daniel in the Old Testament is an excellent example of that. Working in a secular government, relying on God to give him wisdom to get through it, which is the way you just described it, and finding ways to give God credit, which is where it makes us a little uncomfortable, but that's what he did. So he was definitely wearing his reliance upon specific grace on his sleeve, so to speak. Like he spoke it, and that's part of the power of it and the challenge.
Thanks, Chip. Now listen, destructive versus redemptive work. I mean, no one wants to get to the end of the week and think, "Oh, I've done destructive work this week," and probably most people are like, "Oh, that redemptive work, that sounds good." So let's get personal. How have you? Maybe I'll start with the easier question. How have you personally experienced redemptive work?
Well, it's almost like there's redemptive work, capital R, and there's redemptive work, small r.
Mm.
And I think I mentioned that my colleagues and I started a business, and we're not working for faith-based organizations, and we're not explicitly faith-based in what we're doing when we're working under the auspices of that company. And like we just did an exercise with a group of executives where they shared their lifelines with each other. So that's highs and lows of their lives. They mapped it out and they shared it. And there were tears and there was connections and there's common themes. And it was like, that felt really redemptive. No, it wasn't, it's like, it was creating a space where their common humanity came out and they created bonds. And so they were loving each other and the way they listened and respected each other. They don't know it, but they're honoring the image of God in each other. And I think that felt really redemptive, even though it wasn't explicitly Christ-centered.
Okay, good example. Let's switch to the harder question now. How have you experienced destructive work?
Well, I think I'll share two examples. One that I'm responsible for, and one that I was on the receiving end of. I think in my middle season as a pastor, people mustered up the courage to say, "I love you. I love what you stand for and what you do when you're up front, but I don't like working for you. It's hard to work for you. You know, you don't give feedback. You change your mind all the time. You expect a lot, but you don't say it. And um, I really don't like working for you." So that was that was hard to hear, but the truth was that one of the signs of a toxic work environment, or I don't know if it was toxic, but it was unhealthy for sure, was that you have a lot of turnover.
Mm,
We had a lot of turnover in our staff, and
mm.
it took me too long, but eventually I was willing to listen to that and get help and learn why and get better. So that was me. Um, I felt that was destructive. Um, I I also another point in my career, I was working for another organization, and um, I noticed that the CEO would shut down any criticism immediately. Like if you were passing on criticism from somebody else from outside because we were listening, in a posture of listening, or if you had criticism, he would just shut it down. He would literally tell you you were wrong and end the conversation. And that really is a lack of humility. And what it did is every capable person in that organization left. Not all at once, but they left because they were not being invited to the table to collaborate. So, I mean, I think those are two that I've experienced firsthand, and there are more salacious and scandalous examples in the press all the time. Um, Fortunately, I don't have one of those, but they were still destructive. There still was an unwillingness to release the full potential, the God-given potential of the people involved, um, in really both cases, the one that I was responsible for and the one that I was on the receiving end of.
So I'm just thinking, just when we think about that whole area of, in our work and our calling, those two examples you gave, in one sense, am I destroying people's ability to sow into this
Mhm.
organization, or am I destroying their feedback by not listening to them? I'm just, because clearly, in the garden, Adam and Eve were called to go forth and multiply, and anything that destroys, in that sense, is not going to bring growth to people or growth to organizations. So
Yeah,
I
I think
don't think that
that's,
was a
that's I mean,
question.
it's one limit.
Maybe-
Jumping in.
um, okay, I think this is helpful. And if there was one question that maybe you could think about at the end of the week to work out a redemptive week versus a destructive week, is there one or two questions that can be good just to hold as you're going through the week and interacting with people, interacting with your team at work?
I mean, one of the things you could journal on is how did you have a positive impact on the people you interact with in the context of your work? Um, And we also know from our research that your impact on people is your primary source of joy at work. It's not task completion, even though task completion is important. So I just think as you rewind the week, what was a conversation that you thought was authentic and real and life giving to another person, or a decision that you had to make that maybe it's one on one, maybe it's at a kind of granular level of the relationships you have on a day to day basis, or maybe it's more macro, and it has to do with the work that you're doing, and maybe you move the needle on some initiative. Um, but there's a place for reflection. There's a discipline of reflection here, James. I think that's required sometimes to tap into it, especially if you're in a very technical role or you're in a physical. You're making some product, or you're designing software, or you're creating all the back end management of some program that's happening in a different place. It can take some work to think about it. But I was just thinking, like, even when you go to a restaurant, or you take a flight somewhere, when the people who take care of you really are passionate about taking care of you, it makes a huge difference. And you leave that experience feeling differently. And I think slowing down a little bit and noting those moments. Um, I'm thinking about one of my clients who I coach him, and in some coaching conversations, you really feel like you're helping somebody, and sometimes you don't. Um, and he's a little hard to read, but at the end of our session, he looked at his Apple Watch and he said, my pulse has gone down like 25% during this conversation. I feel so much better. And I thought that was a really fun data point. So that makes it into that celebration journal.
I should have asked you your pulse at the start of this interview, and then we could have monitored that at the end of this start time together. So
You should have.
okay. Yeah, no, I think that's really helpful. I was remembering a conversation with another friend, and he talked about, have I listened well, have I blessed well, and have I loved well. So yeah, it was. Thanks for sharing that, because it was recalling some other vectors which can be helpful as we navigate our week. So why don't you go on to your last slide? We'll dig in a little bit more in terms of the specific area of calling and vocation, in terms of what we do and how are we doing the right thing. So over to you.
Yeah, let's jump in. I'll lay out the model, and then we can chat about it. At a very high level, friends, we think of your vocational calling, or God's will for your work life. We think happens at the intersection of the real you and the real world. That's what's happening. And your knowledge about yourself is probably not as complete as you think. You can grow in that. And we're all changing and evolving and growing. And the real world is also in constant motion. And so there's a need for a learner mindset. There's a need to think of this as an ongoing journey of discovery. And that match is probably going to need to be renegotiated multiple times in most of our lives. So that's my introduction. And we'll start with a real you. We think there's 4 primary components of the real you. We start with abilities, and these are the things that you instinctively, naturally do well. That to us is really the foundation of a vocational calling, that you have innate ability. Upon that innate ability, you build skills, which are kind of marketable solutions, things that you know how to do and have proven to do. That your CV or your resume is where you kind of capture the results of your skills. And then we put passions at the top. We don't put passions as the foundation. We think of passion as things that sustain your interest and energy. And we know from our work that people with a certain set of abilities can usually do dozens of different things, and it's their passion that's kind of helps them refine their options at the end. There's a lot, at least in the US, there's a lot of emphasis on just follow your passion, do what you love. We think that's overrated. We think that all of us have thought something was going to be great, and found out that it wasn't. And so we think it's a terrible place to start this conversation about the real you. Abilities can be measured. We have tools for that. You build skills, your marketable deliverables, and then you use your interests to kind of steer you. Surrounding those are your boundaries and or limitations, and um, they can be all kinds of things. They could be I don't want to work at a company that does this kind of work because it doesn't match with my values. It could be I have a young family and I have certain responsibilities and I have to juggle things with that. It could be geography. I never want to leave Geneva. I've never been there. I haven't been there yet, but it looks beautiful, and I could see why you wouldn't want to leave. But we have, believe it or not, we have people that would say, I never want to leave New York. I have to find a job here, and others that don't. It doesn't matter. So we don't like the idea of limitations sometimes, but they're real, and they help you know what's possible and what's not. So that's our map for the real you. And then the real world is a journey of discovery. And there's plenty of things we can learn from Google and online research. And if you're looking for work, online job postings. But we think the most effective way to learn about the real world is to talk to real people and to be aggressive about information interviews, and they're called, where you just meet with people to learn something that's relevant to your quest. And that's what I did when I transitioned to New York City. I talked about that a little bit earlier in our conversation. So when you're talking to people, you're really looking for answers to three questions. One is what they're doing potentially a personal fit? And if there is there opportunity in that space? And I mean economic opportunity in that space. For instance, right now, this has been true for a while, but right now, particularly in the U.S., people who are professors at Christian colleges are finding that they're losing their jobs. Christian colleges are going out of business, so that's not a great field to go into. There's a lot of people looking for work in that space, and that doesn't mean that God couldn't lead somebody to have to pursue it and find a position. It just means in general, it's not the way things are working. And then the last question you ask about the real world is, what steps would a person like me need to take to get into work like that? So we work with students a bit too at Voca, and it's not, New York City is the capital of finance for the United States, and all the major financial institutions are here. And it's not uncommon for a senior to say, "Oh, I would like to go into finance." Like they decide when they're a senior in college or at the university. They can't do it. They can't get a job at a major bank if they haven't had internships at major banks along their career, and so they have to go work for a smaller bank or a smaller institution and kind of make their way a different way. So there's steps that are explored. So that's the way we think about real world. And there's two spiritual principles that kind of encompass this whole journey that are really important. The foundation is our identity, a gospel identity. And 1 John 3:1 says that we're God's children. And that's what really ultimately defines us, not our work. And so that gives us a freedom, we think, to actually ask some of those questions about what are my abilities? What are the kinds of things I really can do consistently well and with excellence? And what are the things I'm really never going to do well? So you have to have some security to explore those questions. And we think we can find that in the gospel. And then a gospel destiny. And this is the promise that God has good work for us to do. It's from Ephesians 2:10, where it says that we are his workmanship and that he has planned in advance for us to do good works. And we think that good works are not just acts of charity or serving in your faith community, but they have to do with the work you do every day. And so when you have that promise that God has good work for you to do, and you have that security in your identity that he's given you, then you can launch out into this sometimes chaotic and often frustrating journey of figuring out, how can I bring the value that God's built into me to the world? Where's that next opportunity for me to do that?
So let me try and summarize all that. So there's a first step in really thinking a little bit about how has God made me in terms of abilities, skills, and passions, but then also, are there any physical boundaries, or are there any boundaries in terms of what I sense I'm not being called to do, either locationally or. And then there's another side, which is then really the exploration, which can uh, come down to, does this fit with me? Is there
Mm-hmm.
even an opportunity to do that out there? And then what are the next steps to move forward into that? Would that be a fair summary of the real you and the real world?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
Okay. Um, how does prayer fit into calling? I know you've got like our identity, you've got gospel destiny. Yeah, how does prayer, the leading of the Holy Spirit, how do these things fit into this model?
Well, I mean, I think that you bathe the process in prayer, and you're looking for confirmation. You're looking for answers in in the real world, though. Like prayer is answered in our lived experience. So I think it's this is a tricky balance, James, because I think it's possible that God can, and I'll use my own story. So I felt kind of a conviction to pursue work in New York City before I was offered work in New York City, and so then the question is, was I called to New York City or not? And I would say I was called to New York City because I got a, and reason I knew that was because I got a job in New York City. Yeah, so it's something had to happen on the ground, and to confirm it.
Mm,
So prayer actually absolutely a sense of the Holy Spirit's leading, yes, but it has to be confirmed in some circumstances. And how long? What's the time? What's the time length? Like how long between the prompting and the confirmation? I don't know. But when you look at scripture, or when you see people led to do something or go somewhere, it's actually usually not very long until that thing happens. And sometimes it's not. I mean, there's 70 years of captivity. That was long in the Old Testament. But I think there's an art there. And one of the things that we see, I think, I was just talking to somebody the other day, and they were saying, I really want to know that my next job is what God wants me to do. So I'm not going to, I want to know that it came from Him and not from me. So I don't want to do all this stuff to search for a job. I'm just going to pray about it and wait for an opportunity to come my way. And I don't think that that's theologic. In general, I don't think that's theologically accurate to say that if I'm involved in the process, then it can't be from God. I don't think that's true. Now, maybe he is being led to just be really, really passive in this time, and I can't really judge that. But when I'll give you two anchors. So one text that we come back to a lot is Ecclesiastes chapter 11. Believe it or not, probably not too many people that will claim that as their life verse. But in Ecclesiastes, the first few verses talk a lot about this iterative process of throwing out seed in the morning and the evening because you don't know which ones are going to take root, casting your bread and in many different places because you don't know which ones are going to come back. And there's this sense of it's very active. It's not controlling the way we like to control things in the West and saying this is going to be successful. It's more of this exploratory journey. I'm gonna go out there and explore, and through that, God's gonna lead. And the other reinforcement of this idea, this sort of open-handed activism. Um, it's not close-fisted. I'm going to make it happen, but it's also not open-handed passivism. Is in the conquest of Canaan. There was a few examples of really miraculous events. Jericho, the parting or passing through the Jordan. There was a day it says that the sun stood still, but it goes on to say that there was a lot of conventional battles, and the Lord gave them victory in them just as much. In fact, most of the battles were not miraculous. They were conventional, but God was still working through those conventional means. So I think, I don't know. I don't know if I answered your question, but it's like there's this sweet spot between overemphasizing spiritual practices, I think, and there's an opposite side of underutilizing them, and with a caveat that, God could really impress upon us a certain approach in any given time in our journey of navigating that real world, real you intersection that could be more pietistic, more mystical than not.
So let's
Great
nestle.
question.
You made a, no, it's really helpful, Chip. Thanks so much for that. And you made a throwaway comment at the beginning about passions being a little bit overrated. I mean, in the world today, a lot of people say you should do what makes you happy and fulfills you. You know, follow your passions would be, I guess, one piece of advice which is given. Is this good? Is this bad? What's your take on this? This, I'll call it, this calling philosophy.
I think it's largely unhelpful. Some of it is attributed to Steve Jobs, and he said at a graduation event for Stanford, he said, do what you love. Life's too short. And somebody in Inc. magazine picked up on that and said, well, when Steve started out in computers, he didn't know what he loved. He was, he had some kind of holistic yoga retreat thing that he was really involved in and trying to do. And yeah, he didn't realize until he actually started to do it that he had an ability to design amazing tech and an ability to almost presciently, understand what we wanted before we even knew we wanted it. Like he really had some abilities there, and because he was good at it, he loved it. And we have a very sophisticated assessment that we use with our clients that objectively measures what the kinds of things that they will do well. And I can't tell you how many times there's a link between the kinds of things they do well and what they're passionate about. It happens a lot. Every now and then there's a complete mismatch, and it's just really, we I think of a person who wanted to sing in the music team at our church who couldn't sing. It was it was painful to listen to. It was painful to have to tell her that she couldn't sing. And I think, if you say, well, I'm really passionate about this thing that I'm not really good at, I mean, why? Why are you passionate about something you're not good at? So I, I don't think passion is irrelevant. We just don't think it's a helpful foundation.
That's really good. I mean, a lot of people, let's go back to that we talked a bit about burnout and calling. And so, how do you determine when it's time to change versus a time to persevere? Because the real world can be, messy. Um, I think it's getting messier. It's getting harder in that sense. And so often when we hit a bump in the road or we hit a challenging period in our job, there can be maybe a temptation to change. So how do we determine when we should press in, when we should, when it's actually, it's time to change?
Yeah. So there's a little book that's really helpful. It's not a Christian author, but there's a good wisdom in it. It's by Seth Godin. It's called The Dip. And Seth charts out in there how in almost every endeavor, you start with enthusiasm, and then there's a dip, and you hate it, and that's when a lot of us quit. And he suggests pushing through that, because when you get to the other side of that, that's often where you get a lot of alignment, you have credibility, you're able to get things done. So I think in general, because we're very passion oriented, we want to feel good all the time, we don't press through dips like we should. So that's my bias. I'll just reveal my bias. And I think for me, um, it was good that I didn't quit when I was burned out. it was good that I pressed through that and I learned and I took some risks and I said things had to change. I have to change. Things have to change, and that was good. I learned a lot, and I became a better leader. I became a stronger person. My faith became different. So I think that's my. So that's another bias I have. That for me, it was good to stay. Now I have a couple of caveats. If you're in a situation that is unethical or illegal, you should quit. You should get out of there. Um, and I just had a client who had a kind of a toxic boss, and he wanted to get out. And we really stepped back and looked at, did he really need to right now? And he did, and he lasted like 3 more weeks than he wanted to. But his boss really started to attack him, and there's a lot of reputational risk for him in that and staying, and so he left. So my point is that there are some situations you just have to get out of. But the other thing I wanted to say about that, James, which is just an interesting trend we're seeing, is that now that as we're post-pandemic, um, a lot of us have the same title, but we don't have the same job. And the pandemic has accelerated that. So I have a client who's a lawyer, and she's actually an introvert, but she liked going to the office, liked seeing people, liked getting out of her house. Like there was something that was replenishing about that whole rhythm. And she has the same title, but she doesn't have the same lived experience of her job. I had another client who loved his job, and then the company was purchased, and he just the way the new owners were working just kind of sucked the life out of him, and he was really thinking there was something wrong with him, because he had the same title, he had the same responsibility, but he actually didn't have the same job. And I think that we do well to step back a little bit and say, well, maybe things have changed, and um, and to figure out, are they navigatable changes or not? But like we don't realize that for a lot of us, our lived experience of work is not the same as it was 3 years ago.
That's very true. I want to go back to the right side of that image as well, because clearly there's a car which is
Do you notice
navigating.
the upgraded? Do you notice the updated car from when I first showed you this?
It's true, Chip. For those who are watching, Chip has very graciously put more of a European model in. He had some sort of big Humvee gas guzzling. I joke that perhaps we might see President Trump. I was surprised I didn't see President, or I should say, past president. We still call presidents, don't we? So
Yes, we
I'm
do.
surprised we didn't see, oh yeah, Donald Trump in the window
We got
there.
a
But
we have a Prius in here for you, James. We took
yeah,
care of
that's
that.
great. You're really culturally sensitive. This new car. So, gospel identity. Speak a little bit about that, because I don't know if is that a natural thing for people to carry, to drive through their work in. What are some of the other things? What is that, and what can replace gospel identity in as we explore our calling?
Well, in Western culture, we have uh, many of us have what I would call it. We have an achieved identity. It's a meritocracy. Our societies are built on meritocracy. You get an education, you work hard, and you kind of earn your place in society through your productivity. Some of us probably come from traditional cultures where you get your identity from your family, and it's still achieved because you have to do the things that your traditional family expects you to do, and you have to get married, and there's vocational expectations that are different from different cultures around the world. But we have these achieved identities that we have to perform in a certain way, and then that's how we define ourselves. And maybe it's a culture. I mean, you can have a sort of a cultural identity, that where you live or that kind of thing. But it's all external and fragile usually, because it has to be maintained. And I think this is part of what makes Jesus good news to us in the West. I mean, you talk about all these other identities, and that you just choose your identity, and it's sort of do it yourself. That's actually creates a lot of anxiety. Freedom creates a lot of anxiety. So a gospel identity is a received identity. It's not an achieved identity. It's gifted to us. And that's a Tim Keller teaching, Tim Keller, Redeemer Presbyterian. And it's this idea that, and he says it in John 3, he says, we are the children of God. What we're fully going to be is still a mystery, but we are the children of God. Like this is an anchor that you can really hook your sense of self in, that it's not threatened by circumstances. So that's the concept. And what you're asking is, well, how do we carry that with us to work? We have to learn to preach to ourselves, I think. We have to learn to talk to ourselves about this and to remind ourselves this, and get into this, get into a pattern that we find ways to remind ourselves that this is true. There's a whole series. Neil Anderson did it in a series of books. But if you just like your identity in Christ, if you just Google that, there's a list of like 100 things that it says about us, and we fill our minds with certain things, and we have to. This is the kind of material that we have to keep reminding ourselves of, and maybe particularly when there's stress or there's challenges or you're heading into a difficult meeting or you're not sure what's going to happen. These are the times when we have to remind ourselves that these are the times we have to remind ourselves whose we are. And I think it's an internal discipline.
So I'm just thinking, in one sense, the real you, the gospel identity, and the real you. In that sense, there's quite a big overlap, and actually, almost our gospel, understanding that we're children of God,
Mm-hmm.
is actually underlies all of these, all of these things, as well as the fact that God has good works for us to do in terms of our destiny.
Indeed, I kind of think of it almost like a circle, that the gospel identity and destinies, like this whole thing that we get all wrapped up in. What work am I going to do? What's going to be next? What's going to happen if our grant funding runs out, or my boss or my supervisor changes and goes somewhere else? And what am I going to like that? We're all dealing with those questions all the time, but that's happening in this circle of an established identity and an established destiny that's already promised to us, and that gives us, I think, some hope, and it can decrease our anxiety, or at least as we process and deal with our anxiety, it can give us a place to run to, and not be dominated by it.
Well, I know. Shortly, we're going to be moving into a Q&A time. So, if you're watching this and you want to ask any questions to Dr. Chip, you can put those in the chat, and we'll make sure we address them. So, but while you're thinking about questions, I'm gonna throw one more question for you, Dr. Chip. So, let's just think a little bit around this. Imagine you've got someone who's maybe starting out, and they're thinking through, what should I be doing with my life? What would be the top three things you would say to them in terms of, these are the three things I recommend you do to discern your calling?
Well, first of all, and I'm really not. I mean this. I think we're assuming they're praying about it, and they want God's desire and designs for their vocational life. Um, so I'm assuming that. I think you should ask your parents what kinds of things they think you would do well vocationally, and if at any point along the way, um, there was always something they always thought you'd be good at. Now, you may come from a family that's more traditional, and it's just like our family's always, doctors and lawyers and engineers, and so there may not be a lot there, but it's one source to think about. A second thing to think through is if you've had any work experience, and it's unlikely that, if you worked in a cafe or something like that, that's what you want to do with the rest of your life. But maybe you can think of what elements of that work were particularly energizing, um, and what elements were not. Um, I think that's another question to reflect on. And then I think I would try and identify 10 people who you admire that you could just interview about their work. What do they do on a day-to-day basis? What do they like about it? What do they hate about it? How did they get into this vocational path? Why do they stay in it? And I would we really I have it's more than just a technique, James. It's a conviction that God has placed in each of our lives the people we need to know, and that part of accessing His provision for us is asking the people around us for their counsel, for their wisdom, for their insight. And as you have those conversations, monitor what's happening inside of you, and what you're leaving with those conversations with. And I had a conversation with a business friend in 2018, and he told me about his vision. He had a lifestyle business, which means you just kind of do enough to pay some bills, and he really started to grow the company as a team. And as soon as he said that, I just lit up inside. And it took longer. Everything always takes longer than I think it will, by the way, but it took longer than I wanted. But in 2020, when we started our for-profit company, that was really birthed from that conversation I had with him. It struck a chord with me. I left energized. I wrote all these notes. I don't think I could sleep that night. And so when you have these conversations as a young person or at any transition point in your career, monitor what you leave with, and then run with it. So that's those three things, I think, would
That's
be a
great. So
great
let me
place.
summarize. So parents,
Yep.
depending on your age, experience in terms of what you may have experienced in terms of just other jobs, and how you connected with that or not. And then thirdly, people, in terms of just interacting and engaging with other people doing different things, and getting a sense of, yeah, is there a leading, how
Mhm.
is there a leading from God in that? Would that be a fair summary of those three things?
Yeah, I would just say with the work, number two, the work experiences,
Mm.
drill down beyond the title to the actual things you had to do on a regular basis or the elements of the job. Because sometimes it's like, well, I didn't like my boss, or I was a barista and I don't want to do. Yeah, but were there pieces of it? Um, Break it down into the pieces and try and find some pieces that you found particularly energizing.
That's great. That's great. Well, I think we may be pulling Adrian now, if I'm right. And there
Yeah,
he
yeah,
is.
yeah.
You.
There he
Boom.
is.
That was faster than a bolt of lightning, or whatever is fast. Faster than Usain Bolt.
I know, right? All
Yeah. Right.
right. Indeed, guys, that was absolutely fantastic. I really enjoyed, the conversation. I enjoyed. Well, two things really struck me. One was just the underlying belief that God has put everything, everyone in your life that you need to know, and it takes active humility to ask, to lean into, and hear God's voice through community, because He's, of course, community, and He provides things through the realm of community. So that was, for me, really powerful. And I love the part where, Chip, you kind of brought down, I think it was Psalms 4, the different kinds of work, in terms of creative work and protective work. And I think it was providing work, I think it was. And I think we all can
That's right.
find ourselves, yeah, in those three or even hybrids of those three. So it's really powerful to kind of see ourselves in scripture in that way. So I want to thank you so much. So guys, so this is where we get to ask some questions of Dr. Roper. So in the Zoom chat, you can simply put a Q, and then put a colon, and then ask whatever question you have. So let's take the opportunity. As he said, God puts people in our lives. When we interview, ask questions, we get benefit from it. So let's not allow this opportunity to pass. So we're gonna definitely allow time for that. But in the interim, while we wait for some questions from the community, Chip, let me ask the question. Have you found a lot of people struggling to find their call because they kind of have a very narrow view of what that may entail, and have people kind of run aground or run amok, so to speak, because of having, I guess, a narrow, unbiblical idea of what calling may be in your profession?
Yeah, I think that for people who struggle with a narrow version of it are typically working in some kind of vocational ministry. You know, we call them professional Christians. You know, and I that's what I think. I think that your professional Christian thinks I'm called to do this, and anything else isn't as good. And then most everybody else doesn't think they have a calling for their work, with the possible exception if they do something in the social sectors. So I think it's like a it's like a caste system almost, where the
Hmm.
vocational ministers have the calling and nobody else does. So,
No, that's
and
pretty good.
I don't remember. I don't know how far back it goes. I do know that I think it was 1965. I think it was Vatican II that they started to talk. The Catholic Church started to talk more about the fact that everybody has a vocation, and some of the entrepreneurship work, the teaching I do. There's a great essay by Father Roger Landry about the entrepreneurial vocation,
Hmm.
and so that's something that's coming up in the Catholic Church too now. That this realization that we all have a vocation, and um, but it wasn't always that way, and I think a lot of us, no matter what confession you're in, it takes a long time for whatever the central folks are thinking about to trickle out to the edges. And so that's my thought on that.
Nice, nice. I would love to read the book on the call of the entrepreneur. I would definitely have a enjoy reading that.
It's Yes, you should. It's really
All right.
good. It's just an essay. It's really good. It's very very rich. It's really helpful and
So Mr.
realistic.
Right here, you can see if you have any questions coming up in the chat.
Just while Adrian's having a look at that, um, how would you respond to, some people think there's only one thing I'm supposed to be doing, and I need to find out what that one thing is with my life, and otherwise I will not be in God's path. Is that yeah, is that true? Not true? You know, could I be doing something which is outside of God's path and plan for my life?
It's that's a tricky question, James. I think it's tricky because um, we always have to make room for the Jonah scenario, where Jonah was called to do something and he ignored it, and it was a disaster, right? So God called him, he ignored that calling, things did not go well. Even when he obeyed that calling, he was really miserable. So he's not a wonderful example of what I think any of us want to be. Um, but I think that's often more the exception than the rule. I think for many of us, there's probably multiple things we can do. Um, I don't know. I mean, like, so when I've told people that I used to be a pastor, some of them have said, "Well, you're still called to be a pastor." So, because once you're called, you're always called. And I don't know if that's I don't know if that's true or not. Um, but then as I think about it, I think, well, there's a lot of things that I do that are fairly pastor-like. It's just in a different kind of scale and format than what I did before. Um, so I think it's hard to know. I do think that the idea that there's one perfect job for you and you have to find it, and if you miss it, it's going to be terrible, is oppressive. I think that's oppressive, and
Amen.
I think you know, like especially when I'm talking to somebody that's younger. I mean, it doesn't matter, but especially younger, it's like what opportunities are actually available to you, and we say it's not an opportunity until you have a letter that says we're going to offer you this job and pay you this much. It's not really an opportunity until it's written down and it's a real thing. So we see a lot of wishful thinking in this space, and I think I might be able to do that, or I think so and so wants me over there, and we see a lot of sort of oppressive ideas that kind of hold people back from realizing that I can be redemptive, and no matter in any work, just about, and it just doesn't really it doesn't matter as much as we think. So, um,
Cool.
so yeah, I
So, but
think.
sorry,
Uh,
sorry, sorry. I'm
go,
seeing
go ahead.
James. Yeah, I'm seeing a few questions coming, so I just want to get to these. So,
Good.
first question I'm seeing is I'm interested in your views on work in industries such as tobacco, say versus the health sector. So I guess they're trying to get at industries that may have a negative kind of connotation. As a believer, how do you navigate in that space? What are your thoughts about working in those kind of spaces? So that's the first question I'm seeing here.
Yeah, I think that unless it's like I think pornography industry is exploitive and immoral, so I would just say you shouldn't work in that industry. I think that's an easy one. I'll just be very black and white about it. But tobacco is interesting because you could say the same thing about alcohol. Um, as Paul said, God's given us all things to enjoy. Jesus turned water into wine. Like but obviously alcohol is abused. So how do you how do you how do you how do you parse that? Of course, the Guinness family, I think we're pretty good Presbyterian or good Protestants here in the U.S. So what do you do with that? I don't. I think it's a matter of conscience.
Hmm.
I think we need to make space for conscience and some diversity of conscience, because God's gifts are abused in every form. So does that mean But it's just a tricky, and some companies might be very aggressive in their advertising and exploitative, and they're of tobacco or alcohol or things like that. And so even though the substance itself might be something that you enjoy from time to time, it's like you don't want to be part of a company that's promoting it in an exploitative way. So it's just we just have to. I think we have to allow room for um, for
Conscience.
diversity. I had a friend who was working in advertising, um, and make room for conscience. I had a friend in advertising who he had to quit because he felt like the way they were treating models, and the way they were portraying beauty was exploitative. And he just had to get out, and other people might stay in. So there's some elasticity there, I think.
Nice. Thanks for that. So I have another question here. How to influence a place of work if there are lots of conflict around you? And it's kind of broader question, so I guess you can just choose an example that will kind of just get to the gist of the question. So how do you be an influence redemptive agent within the workplace where there's a lot of conflict and angst in that work environment?
Well, it depends on your role, and your span of responsibility. And I think if it's conflict among your people that report to you and you're their manager, then you have a lot more authority and responsibility to push for resolution. If it's conflict above you, it's created. This is the way it usually is, right? It's usually the senior person that your agency is somewhat limited, and I think your responsibility is somewhat limited too. Um, so you don't want to be a gossip. You don't want to make it worse. You want to, triangulation is when I have a conflict with Adrian, but I talk to James about it.
Hmm.
And triangulation is is never, it's not biblical. It's not good. So you want to be a person who can can directly deal with that. But as I shared earlier, and that environment that shared was I thought was destructive. Like I couldn't if I told the CEO I thought something was wrong, he didn't go ballistic, but he would shut it all down. I decided I was going to have to leave that organization, and I left after it took 2 years, but I left because I did it very diplomatically. I didn't burn any bridges, but I just felt like I'm not the CEO. I can't control the culture. That's the way he's going to run this organization. I've tried to deal with it, so that's an answer. That's a piece of this, Adrian. You got to push in and try to be direct. Try to get direct resolution, and then if that doesn't work, you go into survival mode. And that's what I think. I just think you decide whether you can tolerate it or not. I decided I don't want to stay in a place like this where the leader is driving the conflict because I don't want to become like that leader.
I hear that. I hear that. And I guess piggybacking on that.
And I had the choice,
Sorry, go
and
ahead.
I know
Go
everybody
ahead.
doesn't have the choice, and I think that's you know
Yeah,
Daniel
and
and
I
his
think
three friends had to work for Nebuchadnezzar, and that was conflict and craziness every day. So I
I
think
know
if I can
above,
sustain
below,
that for
around.
25, yeah, yeah.
So we have another question here, kind of touch on your comment earlier on when you said you kind of left in 2 years' time. So they're asking, so how do you know? I mean, really know when it's time to just really transition out, or really just hanker down and push through? What are, I guess, some key indicators that you can look for on dashboard to say, well, you know what, eject button, or hanker down, buckle down, and let me ride through this until the other side.
This may sound too simplistic, but I think we have to ask ourselves: have I really done everything I can to make this work?
Mm,
In the example I just said, I talked to our CEO. I had shared feedback with him multiple times. I'd watch other people do it. This was not like he was having a bad day. This is a pattern that was clearly proven over several years.
mm,
And so I had real data. I wasn't just doing this on a whim. And I tried to to deal with it in my church. And I was burned out. I didn't leave right away. I like worked with a coach, and I did. So I think you have to ask yourself, what have I tried to make this work? And a
mm.
lot of times, in fact, frankly, sometimes we think we shouldn't have to try anything to make it work. It just should happen. And I don't subscribe to that perspective. I think you know that's one thing to look at. The other thing is, like I say, that it's like, what other opportunities do you really have? Um, because sometimes, if a recruiter is calling you and they've got a great opportunity, you should certainly look at it and see what it is. And and but if there are no opportunities, and I don't know the context of the question, but if there's no opportunities and you haven't tried anything, I would say it's time to hunker down and learn some things about perseverance and taking some risks and self-development and probably some your own anxiety regulation, some other things, as opposed to just leaving. And I don't know if it's true, and it's the same in Europe, but we've had this thing called the Great Resignation here in the U.S. So like almost 25 to 30% of the U.S. workforce has changed jobs in the last 2 years,
Wow,
and 80% don't like their new job. So,
that is crazy.
so
Yeah, I
it's
heard about resignation. I don't know. I don't. I think it's a little bit more an American thing rather than. I haven't heard it happening in Geneva just yet. But yeah, yeah.
Hopefully
That's an
not.
amazing, crazy statistic though. That goes to show that the grass is not greener on the other side.
No, it's not. No, it's not. Wow. See, any more questions we have? I think. Um, so yeah, someone's asking about the PowerPoint. So this session is recorded. So it's live right now on YouTube, and it will be made available for viewing on YouTube and Facebook afterwards. So you can always get the slides and go through the whole process afterwards. So no need to kind of present the slides in that regard to you. Could have really four slides, and the bulk was a conversation between James and Chip over the slides. So you're free to kind of review that content, go over it, and if you want to, you can always screenshot the slide and just have it for your own reference, and that kind of stuff. So As we kind of wrap up this section, I want to give Chip the opportunity to kind of share, anything of value on his end from Voca. Before we come to the last section of our night, which should be where we just come together for a brief time and discuss among ourselves all that would have been discussed, have a brief breakout session, and then we call tonight an end. So I'll let Chip take it away. All right. Let me see. I'm not seeing any audio. Give me a second. All right, Chip, try again.
How about now?
Yep,
Good.
we're good to go.
All right. It's been great to be here. I appreciate this opportunity. It's been a great conversation, James. I love the way you kept firing those questions. That was really fun. And some of like this question about leaving your job, we have a white paper on that, which is complimentary, of course. So you can scan that QR code and download that. And then on our website, vocacenter.org, we have links to our resources, which includes our podcast. We do have an episode about burnout on there. And then you can also sign up for our newsletter or just book a consult with one of our coaches. We offer complimentary consults to people who want to explore these types of questions with a certified professional faith rooted coach. And we have a whole team that will take great care of you as you navigate issues in your career. So it's great to be with everybody. Thank you.
Yeah, I just want to say too with this, I had the opportunity of spending half an hour on the couch with Chip. Uh, and he asked me about my childhood and, I've had childhood fears, but it was a great time of conversation, helped me to think about my own career journey and where I've been and where I want to go. And after just 30 minutes of conversation, I had some takeaways that I could action almost immediately. So I'm not just hyping him up as a brother in Christ saying, do it because he's a Christian. I've actually tested and seen he is good. And I want to encourage you if you are looking at either exploring again this question of calling and where should it go and should I stay, if you're questioning again of what God might be doing in this season of my life, I want to really just implore you and encourage you, take the opportunity to touch base with Chip and his team and go through the process. And I know you'll be blessed because of it. So with that, and no further ado, Chip, I want to thank you so much for spending this time with us. And it was a pleasure having you. And since you've never been to Geneva before, we take that as an open opportunity to invite you back to here to be actually on the soil and go and see our famous jet do while you're here. So, guys, Chip, have a great nightmare. Be good.
All right. Thank you. Take care.
Yes, guys. Hi, guys. So we had a great conversation with Chip. James, thanks so much for doing that. Before we run off, this we want to spend just a couple minutes among ourselves, just kind of asking a few questions about that session. I believe Norman or James, if it's going to be clear, may have